I think before I go into the specific presentation, I want to touch on why it is that we want to recover this in the first place. It comes from a few reasons. One, for me personally, it's because in my quote-unquote line of work, over the last, I would say, probably 10 years, there's been some recurring themes in terms of kind of people's, a lot of the issues that I've kind of been encountering in terms of, people coming to me and kind of telling me about their personal situations. And there seems to be like a theme that's growing, which is this misalignment with what it means to be religious, which is surprising for me because I never thought that's where a lot of these issues come from. And some of the most difficult situations that I've faced are from people who come from religious households. And some of the worst abuses that I've seen have also come from those similar backgrounds, which is quite sad. And it was something I would never in a million years have been able to have guessed, 10 years ago. But that's what I've been facing. And I think, and when I say abuses, I mean it in the sense that I don't think those people wake up each morning and think, how am I going to make somebody's life miserable today? I think what it is that sometimes it's an extreme of a personality where sometimes when you're cornered, I don't want to go into kind of personality framing, but we all have a dominant version of us, the best version of us, and we also have a recessive version of us, the bit that we kind of fall back on when times become really difficult. So, some people who are extremely bubbly and very outgoing and very friendly, the recessive version of them, when they're completely cornered, is that they become very depressive and isolated and very low, and sometimes can lash out in ways that are just completely beyond how they are. And they can be two extreme personalities, and you never think it's the same person. And somebody who's in that moment, it can be very hard to deal with because the person doesn't recognize themselves. And the people that are closest to them don't recognize them. And that becomes toxic because it's very hard to manage without recognizing some of those symptoms and recognizing how those are actually a consequence of an environment that's been created. And that neither of those people are necessarily inherently evil or have gone out their way to become different or change to make the other person's life miserable. It's a consequence of how they've just, gone about their lives. So I've seen situations like that, and we all kind of fall foul of the recessive version of us sometimes because everyone at some point encounters those difficulties. So in that sense, I've encountered these things, and I've found that it often happens, and it may just be a very skewed view because people come to me often with that religious backdrop. So maybe that's what I'm seeing, and I completely accept that might be the case. It's not generally that that's a Muslim thing, and Muslims are suffering with it, but it may just be that the people that are coming to me kind of come to me because they want that religious angle, and perhaps because they want somebody who they perceive to be religious to talk to their religious spouse to try and make them understand that actually there needs to be a balance here. And similarly, parents. I've had parents come to me. I've had children come to me, telling me of. I've had parents say things like, my child is, and the child is usually a grown adult that can make their own decisions, but it's, my child is, he doesn't do these things. He doesn't follow like traditional Islam anymore. My daughter just is not interested in the hijab. She's just stopped wearing the hijab all of a sudden, and I can. There's lots of cases like this. Or my parents are making me, Dad, amazing man, has brought me up really well, and now wants me to marry his niece, and he's adamant, and so on. And sometimes the religious angle is quite strong because, he's a Sayyid, and therefore he needs to marry a Sayyid, so it becomes, you have to marry, and it becomes very hard to find somebody who's from the prophetic lineage, and therefore his father already has a group of nephews and nieces that are already perfectly, they've ticked that box, and therefore encouraging him to go in that direction. And that creates conflict between the parents because the mum has her family, the father has his family, and then all of these sorts of things, and it becomes, can you try and solve it? And the answer is I can't solve it. I can't solve it because I can't change your mentality in one conversation. What I can do is I can be proactive to say, how do we make sure we don't make the same mistakes? Because these are mistakes, they're not right, and they don't work. And equally in saying that, it's recognizing that people who do that they're not inherently evil people. Parents don't want ill for their children. They don't want their children to suffer. Illa the extreme situations where you have parents that probably would do that. The majority of parents they really believe that what they want you to do is good for you. Yeah. And that'll kind of take me into another thing that I want to discuss, which is the idea of this, this wanting to sincerely do well for somebody, because sincerity isn't enough, and often parents do depend on that. This idea that I know this will be good for you. Trust me, it's a good family, it's a good child, and you really believe it. But sometimes that's not enough, because you're not the person that's going to live that life. And the experiences that they're going to have and the society that they're growing up in is just not the society that you've grown up in. And therefore, superimposing your ideal into a world that just isn't the same anymore is a recipe for disaster. So sometimes I just want to say to people that come to me with that, I'll help you get your child married, and I'll even offer to do a free divorce for you, because in about 3 years, that's what's going to happen. And it's going to happen because you're not listening, So it's actually understanding that whether you like it or not, your relationship with your children is very different to how it used to be. And there's no point pining for a world that isn't there anymore. There's no point thinking, well, I was like this with my father, I was like this with my mother, and my children should be the same. It doesn't work like that. You've got to work with society, right? But having said that, the future of society depends heavily on the family. And actually the change comes about, the verse of Quran, Allah says He doesn't change the people until they change themselves. And that's quite critical to some of the things that I want to talk about today. Yeah. Now, what I'm not going to do is go into particulars, because it's quite a heavy topic, and I'm going to give a bit of a broad, abstract overview, and I will leave it to questions, and I'm open to people putting their hands up at any point and asking me a question that you think is quite relevant, and we can, and I'll talk through it. I'm going to avoid doing it myself, because as I was sitting there, I thought I can come up with probably 50 questions and 50 slides we can spend easily an entire seminar discussing, and actually that won't be helpful necessarily, because there might only be one or two scenarios that are relevant to you. But if you feel like there's something that is quite relevant, say so. And this is not one of those sorts of seminars where the sheikh speaks and you stay silent. It's a conversation, and I want you to be able to be part of that conversation. Is that okay? So this is one of 3 seminars, and it's probably in the wrong order. The 3 seminars, one is about looking at your personal identity, so you as a person. The second is about family, which is the first one. And the third one is societal, right? It's looking at from a kind of a societal lens. So I'll come on to that in a second. So the first thing is, let's try and define this. Let's just make sure we're clear about the language that we're using in the title, which is exploring Islamic identity. So there's a couple of things that are related. So this idea of identity and expectations and needs. Yeah. So there will be people sitting here, or perhaps people are not here, listening to this, and in a very, perhaps looking at it very superficially. I'm not trying to be derogatory to anyone who sees it that way, but looking at it and thinking, who cares about this term identity? Like, what does that even mean? And I was in that camp, because for me, you just live your life. You don't ponder on these sorts of questions, because they're not really questions. It's more impositions. Someone mentions the word identity and it makes you question, well, what does that identity mean? But it doesn't influence how you live your life, right? So that's one way of looking at it. But there is another way of looking at it, which is if we take the language out of the equation for a second and think about how you balance your life and some of the conflicting things that you face. And sometimes it's the really superficial, simple stuff. It's deciding, for example, whether you go out with your friends to have a meal, and thinking about prayer, or when you're going out with a group of friends, or you're thinking about going out with some colleagues and they're going to go to a place that serves alcohol, and you're thinking, do I or don't I? And then when you go to that, you'd say, the first time you say, I can't go because I'm doing something busy. I'm being busy with something. That's a placeholder for whatever it is that you make up. Or it's the second time you might come up with something, you blame somebody else, I have to do something for my mum or my dad or whatever. But there comes a point where you have to just make a decision. And when you come to that point where you're thinking of how do I get out of this, that's an identity crisis in a way, because you're trying to what do you do in that situation? And for most people, it's not as clear as, look, that's the line. I just don't do this, right? So when you meet people who are quite comfortable in their identity, what they'll say is, and I met people like that, who would just very clearly from the outset say, I don't really drink. I don't go to places where there's alcohol being served. So if you can try and factor that in, and where that's not possible, completely understand, I'll sit it out. Yeah? That's often a product of your upbringing, but it's also a product of the wisdom that you acquire with age, that you come to become less fickle as time goes on. So when you're 16 and 17, you feel like every relationship is hanging on by a thread. And if I say to somebody that I can't come, there's a fear that how will they perceive me, how will they look at me, how will they judge me, right? So your age is a factor. And as you get older, you start thinking, I don't really care what you think. And part of that is because you formed your friendships, you're more comfortable in your skin, you've taken a beating every now and again, your skin's thicker than it used to be. And therefore, if they don't care about me, so what? It's the attitude, but it's not necessarily a positive thing. I mean, it can be a positive thing, but it can be also negative, because it can be a very pessimistic attitude to say, well, if they don't accept me for who I am, then so what? You may not say those words out loud, but that might be the thinking process. But the fact that those things are happening shows that there's something about your identity that's being challenged at any one point. Yeah? So it's actually quite central to us. So identity doesn't have to be Islam. It could be anything. The fact that your gender is part of your identity, your ethnicity is very much a part of your ethnicity, of your identity. The masjid that you go to can be a part of your identity, not necessarily because of the religious stuff that's going on there, but because the friends that you form through it, or the school that you go to, or the workplace that you're at, or the profession that you're in, the road that you live on. All of these things kind of form certain identities. And as I said, as with age, you become less. I think you begin to appreciate the various identities that you carry at any one time. But when you're young, what you do is you live and embody one identity, which is the kind of the social, the fear of not being accepted. That's quite a common one, which every one of us, and I can recall it. Thankfully, I'm young enough to still recall those feelings of, having friends that smoked, and I didn't smoke, and it was a real difficult thing to deal with, because what do you do when they all just suddenly light up a cigarette? What do you do? I can't stand it because I don't smoke. I can't stand the smell of smoke, which meant I stand there and cough constantly, or I take a step back. And when you when you're in those circles with boys, and you relate to this, because you do this and you're out the conversation straight away. Because what it is it's a bit of, you have your say and somebody else has their say, and then somebody else has their say, and then you have to have another say, and then that's how conversations work. Often they're really silly, right? But you step back from that conversation, and what you've done is that dominant thing that often males will have, is you've just invited somebody else to step in and take your turn. And when you're young, that's hard to deal with, and depending on your personality type, that might be very difficult to deal with. It can really knock your confidence, because you do that enough times, and before you know it, those guys, because I'm a man, and I remember when I was 16, 17, I wasn't thinking about other people's feelings, if I'm being honest. I didn't stand with a group of friends and think, oh, you have your say, you haven't spoken. I didn't do that. And I'm sure most 16, 17-year-olds don't do that. So if they're not doing it, what do you think that happens to the person that gets left back? They literally get left back. And then as time goes on, that person just gets pushed out of that relationship, and they then have to form another one. But again, when you're that age, you don't plan your relationships around commonalities like that. You don't think, I'm going to find a group of friends that don't smoke. You don't think like that. We think very differently. And the same, I suppose, goes for young girls. I think there's certain, smoking will definitely be one of them, but there'll be certain events like that which are quite critical to you forming friendships, and they are so core to your identity at that age that stepping out of that, and that could be not going out on a social event, transforms your role in the hierarchy of that relationship, because you go from being probably quite central to it to being left out of it, and that could be very difficult to deal with, especially if you consider yourself quite dominant in that relationship. The feeling of and this is addressing everyone's ego here, is the feeling of them having fun when I'm not there, or them getting on, because then it makes you feel superfluous, that I'm not core to this. And an extreme example of that, it could be your friends going on holiday without you. The battle that you can go through, or your friends going to the same university. Like 3 of your friends go to the same university and you're the only one that doesn't. It's quite painful. And there comes a point for us, you're not even thinking about the course that you're doing, you're thinking about how do I get there with them, because it's so central to you being. And then as you get a bit older, I think you start realizing the richness of all the various identities you carry, and it makes you a stronger person because of it. And kind of linking it in with the family aspect of this, it's how do we as parents or future parents inculcate that in our children, so that when they're 16 or 17, they're not having the same battle that we had to go through. And I'm generalizing, because some of you probably had a very good upbringing and had all of this built in. And for me, I would say I had a great upbringing, but I didn't have it built in. And I think that's not because my parents decided, not interested. It's because they didn't understand. And the reason why they didn't understand is because they grew up and had their schooling in a different land, completely different country, where a lot of the conflicts that we faced, they didn't face. For example, segregation was the norm, which meant that identity issue wasn't there. You didn't have the choice of going to this university or that university. If you're a girl, you just didn't go to university. Solve that problem, right? And for the men, the same thing. You went to a certain school that was within your village or around your village, which chances are you were probably at the same school or college anyway. And if you didn't, the community was so strong that you had so many circles of like families and friends, and everyone was so connected that you saw each other so often. It was just the norm anyway. So the guy that's your best friend was probably your chacha's son anyway, and you see him most of the time. So there was that. So that network was there. It wasn't as blown up as it is today. So I think it was down to the fact that there was. Now, if you're second generation, perhaps you probably relate to this a bit less. If you're third generation. But if you're second generation, I'm sure you probably can relate to this more. So that's why exploring Islamic identity. So it's this idea of what does it mean to be Islamic, from the context of your family, from the context of you within yourself, and within the context of society as a whole. Like, what does it mean for you to be religious in the wider kind of community sense? And then there's this idea of expectations. It's again, I know people don't consciously think in this way, but it's something that's very important to address, because it does influence our behaviors, and it certainly has an influence and impact on our life. And it impacts your confidence, which is the expectations that society holds of you, and the expectations your family has of you, and the expectations that you have of yourself. So Islamic is just one context, family is just one context. But that's why I said it's abstract, because I need you to, you need to really think about this outside of that. And balancing our needs, which is about expectations are important. Expectations are very important. And as parents and as siblings and as children, we've got to have expectations of people. Because living a life where you don't have expectations on people is a life without trust. If you don't expect things from people, you don't trust people. And not trusting people is equally self-destructive, because you can't do everything yourself, right? So the simple things like, sometimes I will have, like a husband and wife, and the wife will complain, or the husband, and I've had both, that spouse is useless, doesn't do anything in the house. I can't trust this person to do anything, literally. I can't even trust him to have a conversation with somebody. Right? Sound like my wife, actually. So she'll say about me, not her. She's great at having conversation. So I can't trust them with anything. I can't trust them with the kids. So what do? And the solution is, well, I don't let them look after the kids. I just do it myself. So when do you get out? Well, I don't. I take the kids with me everywhere. Yeah. And that person thinks, I'm getting on with life. But So all of us that are not in that situation, for that imaginary person that's doing this, what advice did you give them? Is it healthy to have 2, 3, 4, 5 children in some cases, and the woman or the man, whichever way around it is, thinks that the solution to this imbalance in the household is to do everything myself? How long before that person completely burns out? And not only that, but if you think about it in the context of that recessive personality, what do you think is going to happen to you? If you're that bubbly person that is, happy-go-lucky in life, and then suddenly you're burdened with, and it is a burden, it's very hard to do on your own. You now have to bring up, let's take the extreme of 5 children, with demanding needs, all of which are different. As a parent of 3 children, none of my children are the same. They literally share nothing in common. It just makes me think, what on earth, what happened? Like, they're completely different. So balancing every single one of their needs and requirements, and then managing because one of the hardest things as a parent is managing their routine. Because a child, if there's no routine, there's nothing. That child will own you if you don't give them routine. So trying to keep them in a routine and keeping yourself physically active and healthy and keeping yourself mentally stimulated and maintaining a social relationship with your friends, how is that going to happen? Something's going to suffer. And who's going to get it in the neck? The person that's going to get it in the neck is the very person that you're trying to relieve the burden of. It's the person that's closest to you. It'll be your husband or your wife, depending on who it is. They're the ones that get it the hardest. And when they see that of the spouse, they don't see a parent trying to manage 5 children. And they don't see the burden that parent is carrying on their behalf. What they see is a person that's changed. That every time I walk in the door, you argue with me. Whenever I sit down and eat, you literally don't let me eat before you start nagging at me with something. That's what they see. They see the side of the personality that you actually yourself hate because it's not your norm. It's the side of your personality that you don't recognize. And it's for them, they don't see it in that world. They see it as you're not the person that you used to be, right? And then what you see is an inherently selfish individual that doesn't see all the good things that they do for you, right? That's just how it is, and it's both ways. It's not just, I'm sure everyone's picturing the guy being the lazy sod and the woman doing the work. But do you know what? The opposite does happen. So there's identity, Islamic, there's familial, there's expectations, and there's balancing our needs, which is how do we try and manage all of this in a way that's actually reasonably healthy, right? And I'm going to say from the outset, I'm not going to give you a solution because there's no one tagline that makes it all better. But what I can say is there are certain things that certain notions that you just have to keep in your mind. And I do think this is one of those things that you have to educate somebody. I don't believe, this is going to sound wrong, but this idea that education solves everything. I think timely education solves everything. Education itself is not always everything, because educating somebody who's not ready for it or is listening is pointless. You're not educating them, you're informing them and they're just not taking it in. Education necessarily has 2 components. It has the educator and it has the recipient. If you're not a recipient for it, you're not being educated. So therefore education is useless. It's not education. Yeah. So actually part of a valid education is how do I create an environment where first of all you have the right person in place to educate, and the right person is not just this one person that has all the, ticked all the boxes. Find a life coach who also happens to be an alim, who also happens to be amazing at speaking various languages, whatever language you need to be able to communicate to your spouse or your parents, right? That one person doesn't exist. What you need to have is somebody who's right for your needs, yeah? And there are people that you have generalists. You do have people who are quite good at managing lots of those, they can tick lots of those boxes, but you don't have one person that ticks all boxes, right? So it's about finding the right person that's right for your children or for yourself. So I know, for instance, if I take my children as an example, my 2 boys, right? My daughter's quite young yet, but my 2 boys, if I was to bring a teacher in to teach them, I'm telling you now it won't be the same teacher. Because I know their personalities. The teacher that works for Abu Bakr, Omar will eat him alive, like literally eat him alive. That man or woman would just not survive a day. Because Omar knows he has a way with words. Right? And he will come, and he's younger than Abu Bakr, but he knows how to deal with it. So what I would get is somebody who has who can manage Umar's personality, right? So I know that about my children. And I also have come to learn that about myself. There are people that I can learn from and there are people that I can't. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think as you get older, it's about, there's egos at play and things like that. But when you're children, it's just pure, just being recipient to it or not. So I think education, timely education is important, which is, so I guess what I'm saying is from a practical point of view for us, it's the best way to ensure that you don't make the mistakes is to be aware of those mistakes, And the reason for that is often people become acutely aware of them when they're in the cycle. And when you're in the cycle, there's too much emotion and you're too invested to be able to make change. And it takes a long time. So people who are in the throes of an abuse, and it doesn't have to be a abuse in the criminal sense, right? In this, there can be many abuses that people do that just all adds up to. I mean, in the taking advantage when they really shouldn't be within the imbalance in the household. What happens is when you're invested in it, it becomes very difficult, which means it takes far longer to get out of it. And getting out of it doesn't mean breaking the marriage, by the way. That's one avenue. That's the extreme avenue. There are other avenues to be able to do it. Yeah. So really, a society where you have men and women who know that these are pitfalls that we face and to be prepared for them, that when you do enter that relationship, you're conscious of it, and then you can have a conversation about it. You can genuinely say, look, help me to help you. Help me to make, these are some of the things that I'm prone to. This is what I do. This is how I can behave, and I want you to be open with me when that happens. Because people don't like to do that in close relationships. Nobody likes to tell the other person. When you know you have to spend a lot of time with them, you will delay conflict for as long as you need to. Problem in a relationship is you're with them 24 hours a day. So when the conflict does arise, it'll probably be a saucepan on the head. It's like there's no build-up. There's just boom. It's often quite extreme. So thinking of identity, I wanted to focus on one verse in the Quran. And I think this verse really says it all. And it's quite powerful because I actually went to it wasn't a conference, it was kind of a conference, it was national, so all these leaders came to it. It was a leadership conference. And the entire conference was the idea of tribes and tribalism. So some of you may have attended similar sort of workshops and things within your fields. It's quite a big thing now. And it's essentially, what it says is that the best leaders are those that recognize the various interacting tribes that exist within their flock. Right? So if you're a leader that's completely absorbed within yourself, you won't be able to meet the needs of your people because you won't recognize them outside of your big ego. And what happens is you won't be a leader. You'll just become a good manager, but a rubbish leader. And the problem with bad leadership is that, a leader just the job of a leader is to guide you, right? The job of a leader, and the manager's job is to basically come up with a plan of how it's going to happen. Yeah? Thing is, if you have a bad leader, you might have a good enough manager to get things going and stuff will start happening. But eventually people don't fall back on management, they don't fall back on techniques, they fall back on leadership. You fall back on the strength, the ethos of your organization in the workplace heavily depends on the leadership. So eventually when you disassociate yourself from that leadership and you don't feel that connection to it anymore, if you have any sense of what's the word? I don't want to say self-respect because that's quite harsh. But if you have any sense of being true to yourself, integrity, that's a good word, integrity. If you have that sense of integrity with yourself, you will leave, you just won't stay in that environment because you will see the toxicity of it. You will leave if you've experienced it before, very quickly. So organizations that have bad leadership have bad retention. It's bottom line. I'm making that up. That's having read a lot of papers on this. Looking at retention and when there's bad leadership, there's bad retention. Right? I just read something the other day that somebody in a call center, I related to it because I actually, believe it or not, worked in a call center for about 2 weeks when I was about 16. Right? And I have a lot of respect for people that work in call centers. And you know, one thing I remember is, I remember I was not good at it, to be fair, because I can't, as you know from this slide, I can't stick to script. So you imagine me in a call center, it'd be the worst ever because I can't stick to the script. So I remember once my team leader pulled me to one side and said, let's listen to one of your calls. And it used to be the education maintenance allowance that they used to do. So I was probably even receiving it at the time, and then I was doing this part-time, a few hours. And she sat down with me, and I thought it was a great conversation personally. But she said, you know, you notice, I can't remember how long it was, something like, you were talking for about 3 minutes. I said, okay. And she said, really, you need to be closing at the end of 35 seconds or whatever ridiculous time it was. And she said, look, so that's the first thing. And secondly, you were asking quite leading questions, and then you were giving them quite a lot of support of this. And to be honest, your job is just to do this bit and then just close the call, and then we can because we've got a queue. Understand there's a big queue. I get that bit. And she told me off for it. Another time it was because there was, this time I got moved into council tax, right? And I had this old man, can't remember, practically crying on the phone because this council tax bill had come and they couldn't pay for it. And I can't put the phone down on them. So I'm feeling really bad. So I obviously spent a good 20 minutes with this person, which I shouldn't have, hands up. I didn't last that long in that job, as you can tell. So the point is that I did that for a while, as in that conversation for 20 minutes or so, and it got picked up, and she said, pulled me to one side and said, shall we listen to your call and we might skip through to the main bits? And that obviously gave me a hint that if you have to skip through a 2-minute call, it's going on for a long time, and it was a good 20 minutes, I think. But one thing I remembered about that, and linking it back to what I read just a day or two ago, is somebody from a call center put something up on LinkedIn, and this person said, I was having a horrible day, and the manager walked up to me and said, you know, that last call that you did was a really good call, well done. And then he said later on, in the afternoon, the person came back to me and said, how was your day? And he said it was going horrible until you said that one thing to me. That changed my whole perception of the day. You just give me a bit of positive feedback. And it might have been that person's way of telling him that actually the other calls were probably not as good as that one. But just focusing on the positive changed their entire attitude to that day. And I did think in that moment, had that person have done that to me, I think my life would have gone in a different direction. But I would have been probably a very good call handler in the West Midlands. Probably not necessarily a good thing. But it would have motivated me at least, and I wouldn't have felt so negative about it. But I don't have positive experiences. I don't remember those things. I think that comes down to that's what a leader does. They're supposed to inspire you. It's not their job to put you down or make you feel low about yourself. So anyway, coming back to this verse is quite important. How do I? It's not. Yeah, here it is. This verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that we are necessarily part of tribes, which is exactly what these leadership courses are telling us, right? That how do you deal with interacting tribes? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa unsa, wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila, lita'arafu. Inna akramakum inda Allahi atqakum, inna Allaha alimun khabir. So Allah tells us, He says to us, Ya ayyuhan nas. Right? So mankind, not Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu. Ya ayyuhan nas, mankind. Inna khalaqnakum. Know that it was that when we created you as min dhakarin wa untha. We created you from man and woman. Right? That's the commonality. So this first bit is not about the man, not about the woman. It's the idea that both of you come from you come from the same place. Yeah? It's min dhakarin wa untha is that you have this common feature that you all share. And then after that, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ, and it was after that commonality that you kind of separated into shu'uban. We made you into sha'ab, are like these mini groups. Shu'ub are like groups, right? A people. وَقَبَائِلَ, and we made you into tribes. And I think tribes here isn't just Quraysh, Banu Hashim type tribes. Tribes as in identities. Because when you look at modern, if you just literally Google it, tribes, tribalism in leadership, and you will see there's a plethora of literature on this. Tribes basically means identities. Okay? لِتَعَارَفُوا, but for the reason that you may come to know one another, which is quite powerful. When you look at it in the context of how I translated it, that Allah says, oh man, I have man and woman, nas, people, I have created you with this one common feature that you both come from the same place. Then I separated you out into tribes, and then I wanted you to come back together again. The test is to find yourselves within that again. So I split you up into groups, and then I asked you to look for each other, لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you may to come to know one another. And know that no one tribe is better than another tribe. And the Prophet ﷺ told us this in his last sermon. And it links back to this. Because everyone's identities, you always have the one identity in any given time or any given place. You kind of focus on the one identity, right? But you're never one identity at any one time. You're a multitude of it. There's many versions of you. There's no just one version of you, right? I suppose another way of looking at it is your personality is a tribe that you belong to, because there are people that you share traits with, and there are people that you just have complete difference with. Like you just don't see the world from the same lens at all. A simple example of it, it's like you have some people that love meeting new people. Like, I love being around new people. I love to be in a room where I don't know anybody so I can get to know them. For others, it's like a nightmare. Like being in a room where you don't know people is an absolute nightmare, right? And it's amazing to think people like that exist. Like, why would you want to get to know new people? You'd rather just sit there, or you have some people that would rather sit in a room and hold a book and talk and read the book, talk to the book, or talk to a computer. And there are other people that would just can't deal with a computer. I need people. There are some people, and the way that plays out is some of us, when you need to, at work, I need to sort a problem out, you send an email. And other people are like, I'm going to make a call. I need to talk to him, it's direct. And other people are like, I can't, this is too much, I need to go find him. And that isn't about the nature of the problem. Often it's you. It's how you deal with these things. Some people just like straight email, I don't have to deal with them, I'll worry about it another time. When they respond to me, we create a dialogue, then it may just about warrant me to call them. And I don't feel like I'm calling them and I don't know what to say. For other people, I'm just going to meet them, I'm going to grab them like in a hospital setting when they're with a patient, and I will just waffle until eventually I get out what I need to say. I know people, like I've got a friend of mine, for instance, and if you call him with a specific question, and we were joking about this the other day actually, you can call him with this very specific question and say, look, I have a real specific question that I've got for you. Like you have to be very specific with him. And the reason you have to be specific with him is that he thinks out loud, which means while he's thinking, he's talking. So sometimes you want a 5-minute answer and he will go on for 45 minutes solid, right? And 40 minutes of that is completely irrelevant. But his mind works in that way that he just needs to talk, and you have to just listen. And then he'll go off on a tangent and another tangent, and then he'll find a tangent from the tangent, and he will go around the houses, and eventually he'll say, so going back to your question, and then he will say something, and it's great when he answers it really well, and you think, the 40 minutes were worth it. You want to kill him and strangle him when what he says at the end is, I don't really know. That's when you just want to strangle him, right? People are like that, and other people, I've got other friends, you call him and say, look, I've got an issue, and he'll say, to be honest, I don't know. Just say it. You know what I mean? So you have these differences. So Allah says, Inna akramakum indallahi, that you have these differences, but know that your status with God, your most important status with God, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, is your level of taqwa, is your consciousness of God. That's the only, in any hierarchy, we all have, within every identity, we're in a hierarchy, right? And that's your perception of it. So for example, men and women, if you see yourself as a hierarchy, well, who's higher than who? You know what I mean? In your mind, you'll think, well, obviously men think that they're higher, and men will think, well, no, actually, no, in my household, it's the other way around. So it's your perception really, isn't it? In the same way, you might think of hierarchies in the workplace, like your manager is in a higher up hierarchy than you are. In terms of your parents are higher up in the hierarchy. We all have these hierarchies that exist within us. But don't confuse hierarchies with who is greater, who's better. And that's the other thing within the leadership movement. There's this whole idea about how do you become a personable leader. And you'll see lots of literature on this. It's amazing to think there is literature on how does a leader become more So for instance, has everyone heard of this program called Undercover Boss? Right? So Undercover Boss was happening in the Muslim society about 1,000 years ago. I kid you not. That was the norm, where one of the things that caliphs used to do is they dress up like ordinary people and they go out to hear what people had to say about them. And they'd ask them, so what could the caliph do differently for you? And they would do that. It was very normal. If you read about Islamic Spain, it was quite common for a couple of the caliphs. They would literally do all their business and then dress up in rags, and they'll go out in the public and just hang around and just see what people are saying. And they'll go and try and fix it in whatever way. Yeah. Sometimes it may be misused or abused, Allahu Alam, but there were many occasions where it was put to good use. That was undercover boss, right? So what you're getting now is, again, I can only speak from an NHS setting because most of my career has been the NHS, but what you get is CEOs doing this, these kind of, what they'll do is they'll go out and spend a day with a given service. Like, sometimes, like our CEO once went out and spent the day with IT. Just spent the whole day just with watching IT doing stuff. And what it taught her is, not taught her, but what she saw was how useless she was in that domain, and how indebted she is to these people that are specialists in it, because if it wasn't for them, the hospital wouldn't run. So it gets you to appreciate what's life, how dependent you are as a leader to them. And what that means is that you find commonality with one another. You know what I mean? So it's a whole movement. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that, look, no one of you is greater than the other, because actually you're all dependent on one another. And the hierarchy in that sense is meaningless. Like, who cares whether men are above women if the bottom line is women can't survive without men and men can't survive without women? That's the bottom line. We can't survive without one another. And I know it leads to like patriarchy and all of this stuff. Right? You can talk about that all day long. The bottom line is, and we will come to realize, that no society can function with only one gender. It just isn't going to happen. And no society can function just with leaders, because leaders that are a flock are completely useless. They're just crazy men that are directing nobody that wants to listen. And it's just a bunch of egos. And similarly, lots of worker bees are completely useless if they don't have anyone to direct them. No one in the hierarchy falls flat on its face if every part of that hierarchy isn't adhered to and there isn't someone there that does the job, and does their function. Which is what Allah says, nobility isn't defined by where you are in the hierarchy. Nobility is defined by your relationship with God. Inna Allaha alimun khabir. And know that Allah, and this isn't by accident, I really believe whenever Allah mentions these names in the Quran, He mentions them, He picks certain names for certain verses for a reason. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions two names. One is Allah is all knowing. And I think that appeals to your sense of confidence, or this feeling of being alone, that nobody knows our plight. But Allah tells us in the context of that there is somebody that knows your plight. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. Inna Allaha alim. And He could have chosen Qadir. Allah could have said He's all knowing, all powerful, but He didn't. He chose Khabir, which is the acquainted. But Khabir comes from the word the one who informs. Akhbara, khabara means to give khabar. So not only is the God all-knowing, God is the one who can change people's perceptions. He's Khabir. He is the one who informs. So perhaps through your plight, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will inspire other people through your behavior to see the wrong that they're committing. So Alim and Khabir are very closely related. Alim is about knowing, and Khabir, you could say, is acting upon that knowledge. He informs. And I think when you talk about hierarchies, it's always good to throw in a bit of Maslow's hierarchy, just for good effect. But I think it's quite relevant here in the context of the three domains that we want to look at identity through. It's those of you. How many of you are not familiar with Maslow's hierarchy? Let's you're not familiar with it. So a couple of you are not familiar with it. So this is the idea that if you look at it at a societal level, society. If you forget society, you on a personal level, for you to flourish, if your goal is to flourish, and flourishing can be defined in many ways, but let's say it's the optimal thing. Let's say it's for your idea of flourishing is that you become successful in some venture that you want to do, right? So if you start off at the bottom of that chain is you as a child, right, where you're completely dependent, and when you're 3 months old, you're not creating flyers and writing a website for when you become eventually a fully fledged businessman. You're not doing that. At that point, the needs that you have and the priorities that you have are to just be, fed and watered. You want to make sure that your mother and your father give you milk and make sure they change your nappies when you need the nappies being changed. If that stuff doesn't happen, you don't get very far, right? So the very basic thing that you need is your absolute basic needs that are absolutely necessary in order for you to flourish later on. Yeah. So Maslow's hierarchy kind of dictates this idea that as a society or as a people, first and foremost, you serve your basic needs. And you will do anything to preserve those basic needs. Yeah? You will sacrifice long-term goals and all of these things if it means that you get food tomorrow. Because you need to. There's no point living in a vision for what the world will be like in 6 months' time. Right? Imagine on a desert island and you're thinking, I'm going to imagine the oasis that I'm going to create I'm going to create a Dubai here, and spending 6 months thinking about it. And in the meantime, there's been a hurricane, and you haven't even erected somewhere to sleep under. You'd be dead before nightfall. You wouldn't survive long enough to live out that vision. So vision's useless in that case. What you need is basics. And then once you do that, once you attend to your absolute basics, the next stage is what he calls like safety. Because once you've got food, you need to now make sure that you're safe enough to be able to make use of it. So, protecting your food, protecting yourself, part of that preservation is to ensure there's safety. So as a society, you put mechanisms in place, laws in place, right? The absolute basic principles, the tenets of law that ensure that people feel safe enough to tend to their basic needs. But then eventually, there's that third phase, which the society will become more, you need laws that are more robust, right? Laws that are not just reactive, but they're proactive. Yeah? And this is about planning, starting to begin to plan for the future. It's not only how do we move from, finding bits of food and making sure we don't get hunted, to thinking how do we plant those foods and plant them in a place where they're protected? How do I get a group of people that can look after those, and that becomes their job? And in the meantime, we take on a job, we erect houses, and then so it's trying to plan for that medium term. Is that okay? So you're thinking, you're freeing yourself up, you're creating capacity so you can do other things, you can eventually flourish. And then the next level above that is when you have your basic needs sorted, you have a plan of action for how you ensure your survival, and now it becomes about what you can call your esteem. Right? This becomes, when you become within your own head, it becomes about your position. So it's not just how do we erect houses and how do we make sure we've got food on the table, it's which of these do I want to do? Yeah? And what's my role in this? Am I going to be the digger, or am I going to direct people to do the digging? Yeah, it's that sense of where do I fit into that hierarchy now? Yeah, and in a simple way, it's just the more time you have, right? The more time you create, the more you fill it. Yeah? And what you fill it with is self-preservation. Maslow's hierarchy is ultimately about self-preservation. So what you're doing is you're filling it with preservation. And actually, if you look at the Quran, the Quranic narrative is you don't want to do that. You don't want to just free up time and then just fill it with self-preservation, because that will very quickly, all roads will lead back to you. It'll be about preservation of self. Yeah. So what you need to do is you need to direct it towards God. You need to fill the vessel, as the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, that the heart is like a vessel. If you don't fill it with good, it'll fill itself with evil. Right. So this idea that you have to find a positive way of filling it, which is not just about you being at the center of it, but it's God being at the center of it. Okay. And you facilitating. And then finally, what's called the intellectual needs of fulfilling the self-actualization, which is the fulfilling or the flourishing aspect of it. And what I did was I kind of just changed that slightly, in that what's the function of family and the three areas that we're looking at. The self I put right at the bottom, right? The self is the most fundamental part of developing. And what you want to achieve ultimately, the Quranic narrative and the Prophet ﷺ, what he encouraged was preservation of society. Right? What you want is a moral, upright society. And what you need to be is the vehicle through which it happens. Yeah? But you can't do it on your own. You can't do it on your own. You can be the most morally upright person, but if you can't influence somebody, then when you die, that sense of uprightness dies with you. Yeah? So therefore, what the Quran calls to is it calls to endowing responsibility. You'll notice, look at all the relationships that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encourages. It's all about ensuring responsibility. Because what it does then is that second phase of how do you take it from self-preservation, how do you move from self-preservation to societal preservation? The way you do it is by realizing the fact that we ultimately came from the same place, right? So it's connecting yourself to society, and the way you do that is through your family. And family is quite a broad term. It doesn't just mean your biological family. So family just represents relationships. Yeah. So there's a real call in the Hadith about preserving and creating responsibility. Responsibility to your parents, responsibility to your children, responsibility to your friends, responsibility to your neighbors. I will talk about some of these things. I won't be able to go on about all of them, but you'll see that the entire thing, it's got nothing to do with, I don't think it's got anything to do with just the biology of it. It's about creating responsibility, getting out of yourself and connecting yourself back to from your qaba'il to yata'arafu, this recognizing that it's all one big circle, that what you do, God doesn't change a society until people change themselves. Yeah? Society's at the top. If you want to change it, you've got to influence yourself first and foremost. Okay? So our ideas of what is and isn't Islam or Islamic are first forged at home. Yeah? Because we're focusing on that central bit. Family, the first step is the first step to that preservation, inculcating and promoting a morally upright community. Okay? So how you are with your family is going to dictate how your family ultimately are with their family, and so on, and that's how society and culture is formed. And family is a subset of your obligation to the ummah. Yeah, this is a very much part of us as Muslims, is that you have an obligation to the community, and I don't just mean the Muslim community. The ummatul ijaba and the ummatul da'wah. Has anyone ever heard these terms before? Ummatul ijaba are the Muslim community, but the Muslims never recognize this one community. We split into two. The ummatul ijaba is the community that has accepted, that have heard the message and accepted Islam. And the ummatul da'wah is the community that hasn't accepted it yet. We only ever split the world into two parts: the people that have accepted Islam and the people that just haven't had the chance yet. Yeah? And what that means is that they haven't seen the true beauty of Islam yet. In other words, the responsibility is on us to show them the beauty of Islam. Okay? So they were always part of the ummah. We don't have this ummah of just Muslims alone. There's an ummah in terms of the entire world. So our obligations extend to the wider community, the ummah, which is not just the Muslim community. There's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, it's quite a famous hadith, which kind of going specifically into the immediate family unit, where it's literally lifted this off the internet, so as you can see it's not formatted. So the hadith this is narrated by Imam Muslim, that beware, every one of you is a shepherd and every one of you is answerable with regard to his flock. The caliph is a shepherd over the people and should be questioned about his subjects. A man is a guardian over the members of his family and should be questioned about them. A woman is a guardian over the household of a husband and his children and should be questioned about them. A slave is a guardian over the property of his master and should be questioned about it. And beware, every one of you is a guardian, every one of you should be questioned with regards to his flock. That's a very powerful hadith, because what it says is that there's no such thing as leaders and followers. Everyone is a leader in some way. Yeah? Every one of you has a quality and an expectation as a leader in some way in your life. So what that does is it goes from a disempowered place to an empowered place, to say, you know what, you have a responsibility of within the remit that I have, how can I influence ultimately a morally upright society? How can I do it? And the Prophet ﷺ tells us that we'll be accountable for it. And other hadiths, the Prophet ﷺ extended the family. Yeah? He extended the family to those that you love. So that's your friends. Yeah? They are part of your family. You have a responsibility towards them. There's explicit hadith about your neighbors, whether you get on with them or you don't. For instance, in the books of fiqh, so in the old days, so this is obviously we don't have the Sharia legal system here, but in the Sharia legal system, if I wanted to sell my house, right? If I wanted to sell my house, you know who I have to ask first? My neighbors. And legally, if I sold my house without offering it to them first, they can take me to court and say, we had first rights. And the reason for that is because the Prophet ﷺ told them that this is because when you leave a house, you walked away with the money, your neighbors have to live with the consequence. Because if you put someone into the house that ends up being a disaster for them, then that's unfair on them. You've imposed on them. That's an amazing thing to be that considerate, to think you have to recognize your neighbor's rights. So although the Sharia system is here, we should be considerate of that. We should be considerate of the fact that when you ask, and it may be that it's not appropriate within, and that's fine, but it may well be if you're in a dominated, Pakistani or Bangladeshi community, they'd probably bite your hands off for offering in the house because they want the house. Yeah, probably to extend it and move their grandchildren in. But the point, that's not for you to decide. The point is that we should make a point of offering it to them. And then the reasonable test comes in, because you might think, well, what if they're offering me less money? Well, the driver for buying and selling a house in the old days wasn't how much money you earn. There's a really nice narration that I remember of, I think it was Hassan al-Basri, I might have got this wrong. And somebody, so this person went and purchased, someone asked, so someone was selling a house, and they said, how much are you selling for? And he said something like 20,000 dirhams. I said, 20,000 dirhams? It's only worth about 4,000. He said, yeah, he goes, I'm 4,000 for the house and 16,000 for having a neighbor like Hassan al-Basri, because you're never going to get a man like him. This idea that, the neighbors is what made your house. That was the community what made your house. It wasn't the physical, the building itself. And in other madhabs, like in the Maliki madhab, and I could have put my hands up that it might not be the dominant position of madhab, but I'm aware that they have at least one position in their madhab that says, when you sell something, you can't sell it for more than, I think it's 30% of the value you bought it at. Because it's unjust. It's unfair. Because you might have bought a house and lived in it for 20 years, and you look at the value as it is now, but you still bought it for a smaller amount of money. And when you think about, I'm not saying necessarily I agree with it, but in the context of buying houses, imagine if everyone just did that. It would mean that, there would just probably be more equitable distribution, probably. It might not work in other areas, but I think in the housing area, it probably would be, quite useful. And the purpose of that is, and he actually took it from Hadith, to prove that anything beyond that is you're taking advantage. So there's this idea of being considerate and creating, and that sort of community is not forged out there. You don't become like that by being out there. You become like that when you're brought up in a household like that. When your father shows you generosity, trust me, you will go out and you will be a generous person. You will have that inculcated inside you. There's a responsibility that we all have to our community, and that community is a vast community, and it starts at home. And the Prophet tells us through this hadith that don't think that you don't have a role in your household. You do. And that role may be small, but it's not insignificant. That's the thing, it's not insignificant. So an older brother has a responsibility towards his younger siblings, or an older sister has a responsibility towards his younger siblings. What time are we on? I've got half an hour, okay. Okay, so so the Quran places great emphasis on the idea of responsibility. So let's touch on a couple of these things. So I put this is more of a note to self actually. We need to move to an evidence-focused society to make educated assumptions about our micro behaviors and the impact on long term. That was a note to self. I don't put it in the slide, but I didn't mean to put it in the slide. But it's quite an important thing, which is, part of, so the practical message, I guess what I'm telling you is that where we are the future. Like how you are with your children will dictate how the society is in the Muslim society, let's say, is in 20 years, 30 years time. And don't make no mistake, that's what will happen, right? So we need to move towards more of a, so although I've mentioned a few examples of hadith, etc., there is a huge amount of literature now that has taken its learnings from experience. And what we had was the Prophet ﷺ that didn't need that experience because he was guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what you find often is this complete match between what we're learning today about human behaviors and societal behaviors and what the Prophet told us all those years ago. We're finding that. But that's not to say we should say, oh, the Prophet told us already, we know it already. No. We need to think, there's a lot of literature on this, we need to learn from it. So as a community, we need to become more educated in the sense that we need to start learning about this literature. So learn about human psychology, learn about micro behaviors, and learn about impact on others, and actually treat yourself as a leader. Take whatever, if there are courses that are available that are free about leaders, don't think that's for leaders that are CEOs, they're not. Therefore, every one of us, that you should be finding those things, that seek them out and go to them, because let me tell you, they are going to make such a difference to your life at home and how you behave. Because the only thing it emphasizes, in the number of programs I've been on, the only thing it emphasizes is how to become conscious of your behavior and how it impacts those around you. That is literally what it emphasizes. How is that not going to help you with your conflict at home or conflict with friends? How is it not going to prevent conflict from arising? You know, isn't it better to see conflict bubbling and addressing it before it becomes something than to be completely oblivious of it until it finally arises? And most of us live in a reactive sort of way where you just kind of get on with life, and then suddenly you get hit by something and then you just deal with it. Whereas the Prophet may encourage that. He didn't encourage that at all. He encouraged the opposite. And actually, when you did that, he encouraged the opposite of what you might think he would say. So he encouraged us to be proactive, to think about things before they arise. Many examples of it. For instance, when you learn about the life of the Prophet with his family, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but you look at all the hadith about it, they're fascinating to look at them in light of the context in which they were done. For instance, you look at the hadith about the Prophet playing, racing with Sayyidah Aisha, and you might hear about it in the context of him, just being playful with his wife. But that's not the context. The context is that the Prophet's been away for a long time. He's out in a society where he's having to, they're in Madinatul Munawwara, they're in no man's land, he's creating brotherhood. The Muslims are a minority. They're living in other people's houses. Imagine that sense of pride that these Muslims that once had so much have come to nothing, and he's trying to manage that. Then there's the fear of this constant threat from Mecca of when are they going to come and fight us. Badr is around the corner. You've got these various Jewish tribes, the three big tribes, the Banu Nadir, the Banu Qurayza, and trying to negotiate with them, writing a peace treaty to ensure that the Muslims are protected, the minority are protected. When all of that's happening, and his wife's not seeing him very often, so what does he do? You see all of these playful behaviors come out then. In that context, you see nothing negative. It's all about, he would race with her. Or he sometimes, so one of the really nice narrations that's in Sahih Muslim, I believe, is where the Prophet would, Sayyidah Aisha tells us this, which shows that she remembered these things because it was times when, it's the time when you least expect the man to be playful, you'd expect him to be lost in thought. And she says, sometimes when we would sit down together and eat, I would take some food, and he would see where I've taken my food from, and he'd take food from the exact same spot. Right? Whenever I'd eat a piece of meat, he would take that off me, and he'd eat from exactly where I ate. And he was showing her affection. And then she says, whenever I'd drink water, he'd wait till I drank some water, and then he'd take it, and he would turn the cup to where I drank it from. These are all signs of affection. But you got to ask yourself, why did he feel the need to do that? Because he recognized, I'm not saying there's conflict, I'm saying he recognized the nature of human beings, that when you're away from somebody, they have a calling, they have a longing. When someone loves you, they want it to be around you, and they want to feel like you're around them, if not physically, but you're emotionally connected, around them. So that's why he would do it, because it was this constant reminder that, you're still a part of me. And sometimes when she felt like she was at home, he would take her with him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He would actually imagine that he would actually take his wife on a long journey, and she would be on this horse, and she would just be there with the famous example, a very well known example, is where he had they were coming back from this long journey, and we're talking they'd been on a journey for days, and Sayyidah Aisha in the middle of the night she says, I've lost my necklace, right? I've lost my necklace, and the Prophet looks at her. you lost your necklace. Yeah, I've lost it. I don't know where it is. He said, okay, we'll look for your necklace. And people said, but what about this, that, and the other? He said, no, we're finding the necklace. So they spent half the night finding the necklace until they eventually found it. So it was because of that, so it was in that instance, it was in that incident where the verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the verse about dry ablution, right? Because it came to a point where they were now in no man's land, there was no water. And I thought, well, the Sahaba said, how do we do wudu? And some people are saying, we've just spent the whole night looking for a necklace and we're going to miss our prayer. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the verse about dry ablution. So it became a source of mercy to everybody to the end of time just because of that one act of kindness from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah? But again, the context wasn't that it was just him sallallahu alaihi wasallam at home with his wife. This was in a difficult situation where your sense of, for any one of us, it'd be a test of your manness, your manhood, right? Where we're talking egos, it'd be all the lads are with you and your wife says, I've lost the earring. And you'd be thinking, look, I'll get you another one, just get on the horse. Let's get to where we need to be. That's right, that's what you'd probably expect of your spouses or even your parents. So that's a test of leadership. And the Prophet said, no, because every one of us is equally important. If that was your necklace, I'd stop for you. So it was, stop, let's look for the necklace. And it wasn't 15 minutes, it was about 3 or 4 hours at least where they looked. And it wasn't just the Prophet looking for it, he had everyone looking for it. Now you imagine a cavalry of people who have just come from a battle and they're like exhausted and he said, now we're finding a necklace. And they're thinking, all right, so I'll sheathe this bloodied sword that I've just been doing all my man's work and now I'll go look for a necklace. But they submitted to it because they saw that it wasn't just his wife. And that's another important point, which is, people don't respect that sort of behavior when it's confined to just those who you directly love. For example, I would have very little respect for a leader if I saw the way they were with their husband or with their daughter or their son. You wouldn't respect that person. An example of that is when you have this nepotistic behavior of where, you have a CEO who puts his son at the head of a bank or something, or you have it in your small your masjids, for instance, right? Some masjids will do that. They'll put their, not all of them do, but some of them will do that, right? And we know of situations like that. And I'm not even saying it's always bad. Sometimes they genuinely are the most qualified. But in those instances when they're not, how can you respect people like that? Because you think, that's not on merit. And the Prophet ﷺ lived a life of meritocracy. He gave based on your merit. He didn't give it based on family. He didn't give it based on a connection that you had with them. He gave because that's what they deserved. Right? That's a very important quality of leadership. So the point I was making here was that this idea of being evidence-based, that the Muslims, we need to be ahead of the time, ahead of the curve. We need to be looking into these evidences and thinking the research, then there's plenty of it about managing micro behaviors and how it impacts your day-to-day life. Learn about it and try and put it into your life. It will genuinely make you a better husband, a better wife, a better person, hopefully. And the other thing is about responsibility, which is the key thing that I want to get onto now, which is the idea that the Quran called to responsibility, and family was one mechanism through which it created responsibility. And that was to say that, your parents gave birth to you, and well, let me take a step back. If we accept that human beings, left to their own devices, will do what it takes to preserve, right? And there are two camps on this, and I don't want to get into the ethical theory about fundamentally how would humans behave if they had to survive, right? Because there's a lot out there on that, and it's not the time to go into it. But if you go with this idea, which is, I think, links in with the Quranic narrative, which is man left to his own devices would be destructive. Yeah? And the reason for that is God's not in the equation. Right? So man on his own, that's why you need God. Right? God, it represents the all-seeing, all-powerful that regulates you. Without that regulatory authority, you will be a mess and we wouldn't survive very long. That's what we stand for. And the word we use for it is taqwa. Taqwa is everywhere in the Quran, and it means divine vigilance. It's knowing that God exists is what regulates your behavior. Yeah. So if we go with that idea for a moment, then then why would you have any affiliation to your family? Why would that happen? You might think, well, it happens because of love. And it's true. It does. Love plays a big part in it, right? But what you call love also has proximity attached to it, which is like as follows. Every day you probably look forward to going and seeing your parents, right? I hope you do, right? You look forward to seeing your parents. And then what happens is, let's say you get married or you go and live away from somewhere. And what happens? Initially you miss your parents every day, and then you miss them every week, then you miss them every month, and then eventually you'll be lucky if you remember them every 3 months. And then it goes from you calling your parents calling you saying, you haven't called me in 3 months, right? And if you're married, especially for the men, every now and again you sit with your mum and she kind of starts crying and says, you don't even call me these days. And why do you think that's happening? Is your love diminished for them? Your love hasn't diminished in any way, or hopefully it hasn't. It shows that proximity and that affiliation is very important. You need to have guidelines to ensure that you give them their rights, because if you didn't, 6 months later you would barely stay in contact with them, right? Because that's how similarly with your spouse, there are probably more fundamental differences between men and women, perhaps, I don't know, but let's I'll go on the assumption that there are some fundamental differences in terms of the kind of the emotional need, let's say, which is probably imbalanced slightly. Not necessarily a bad thing, but there is a difference. So therefore, what you find is, men will probably argue, I don't need as much proximity. I'm generalizing. Whereas a woman probably would argue, not every woman, might say, well, I do. So when he's not home 4 days a week, I feel like he's not here at all. And then that translates into, you might as well not be here at all. Yeah, and that turns into that destructive anger of, well, what's the point of you coming home? All you do is come home, eat, and leave again. You see what I mean? So there's that exists. Now, if Islam didn't regulate that, then what's going to make that imbalance? How are you going to shift that imbalance and make it a bit more balanced? You need Islam to remind, or you need, let's not say Islam. You need something external, some external force that encourages that to happen. Yeah. So Islam encourages that. So let's start with the parents, which are fundamental. I don't know if you've ever wondered, why does the Quran never emphasize brothers and sisters? It doesn't talk about your siblings. Why doesn't it do that? It's something to think about. And not only that, but it really drums home the message about your parents. It drums home the message about your parents. And I think one of the reasons is, Allahu Alam, but one of the reasons is because if you go back to that verse about you came from man and woman, right? And the first step to recognize, it's like realization doesn't come, it comes piecemeal. Where we don't have it in us to just suddenly have the vision of perfection. We don't work like that. We go from, we didn't go, like my teacher used to say to us, he said, when you were born, did your parents ever try and feed you roast chicken? I said, no. He goes, exactly. He said, because that's not how human beings work. He said, and the context in which he is telling us that is, we were there learning basic Arabic morphology and asking him really existential questions. And he would say, I can answer the question, but you're not ready for it yet. So, you're a child right now, and we've got to nurture you. And what he'd say is, that is, Allah has given you that. He could have easily created you baby, adolescent, fully fledged adult, 40-year-old adult, old man, old woman, and if you wanted to do that, and each one you spend about 5 years, and you could have done that, why did God choose the process? And the reason for that is because it teaches man that we learn through process. That I needed to get my finger stuck in a bike at 3 years old. For what happened at 4 years old, I didn't do it again. Yeah. So you need to go through the process. And psychologically, in the psychological literature, there's a lot of work on this, a huge amount of work on the idea that, for instance, human beings, the only reason, so your level of aversity to risk is very closely linked to what you experienced as a child. Yeah. So, for example, one of the common ones that's used is, when children play with their dad, and the dad gets a bit playful with them and gets a bit restless, and every now and again just elbows, like I've done that to my kids. Like they get on and then you kind of push them off and they annoy you and they fall and they hurt themselves and one of them starts crying. And then you say, you're all right. Yeah. I'm teaching them a couple of things. One is there's a limit. I'm not consciously doing it, I'm just playing with them. But what he's learned is that there's a line that I don't cross with my dad. And when he's tired and he says, get off, I better get off. And he also knows that if I fall off, dad, it'll hurt. And I also know that when I cry, dad will rub my stomach. He's learning things that will help him in the future. But in the future, when he's walking down the street and he sees somebody looking slightly aggressive, he will start making those same links of what could happen if I don't listen to my instinct and what I should do to avoid that instinct. So what happens as a child, that playfulness teaches human beings as they get older about the appetite for risk and avoiding certain things that might not be too good for them. So it's a necessary. So playing with your child is a necessary feature of development as you get older. That's just, there's no question about that. That's not even there's no debate in that. That's just how it is. Yeah. So going back to the idea of responsibility. So there's an interesting thing that Freud said. He said most people don't really want freedom. So everyone, the freedom to decide, the freedom to. He said because freedom requires responsibility, and the one thing people don't want is responsibility. Ibadat is a form of forging togetherness, so I'll talk about some of these things, but let's just take the fundamentals before we get onto parents, which is salah. So what's salah? Salah creates the obligation to God. That's what it is. The act of prayer itself, the physical standing, God doesn't need it, which is why Allah tells us in the Quran. So Imam Ghazali mentions this in one of his books. He says, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. It's a quite interesting thing. He says, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about people who pray in two contexts. The first context is He says to him, yuqimus salah, yuqimuna salah, yuqimus salah, like Surah Bayyinah, for instance. Yeah? Allah says, yuqimus salah wa yu'tu zakah. And in another context, Allah says, wa yusalluna, yeah? Or idha qamu lis salah. So there's two ways in which God talks about prayer. One is where Allah talks about qiyam lis salah, standing for the prayer. And the other one is where Allah talks about the prayer itself, yusallun. Yeah? And He said the different in that whenever Allah says standing for prayer, He's talking about believers. And when He talks about the prayer itself, He's talking about hypocrites. It's quite a fascinating insight. When you go to it, every time Allah talks about them, like in Surah Ma'un, أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ. Actually here, it's interesting, يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ فَذَلِكَ الَّذِي يَدُعُ الْيَتِيمَ وَلَا يَحُضُّ عَلَىٰ طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ salah. And may hellfire be for those that pray. But it continues, فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ. They're lazy in their prayer. So what that teaches us is that it's not the act, the physical prayer itself that God needs. That's not what He's asking of us. It's the qiyam lis salah. So then the question is, what's qiyam? What's standing for prayer? You find the answer to that in Surah Bayyinah, where Allah says, لَمْ يَكُنِ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ وَالْمُشْرِكِينَ مُنْفَكِينَ حَتَّى تَأْتِيَهُمُ الْبَيِّنَةِ. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this idea of the bayyinah. And He used this word qayyimah in there. Yeah? Or qiyaman. What does qayyimah mean? So bayyinah means that the complete, the realization. Bayyinah is the realization. And qayyimah is steadfastness. So Allah wants two things from you. One is to know, acquaint yourself with the bayyinah, right? The clear message, meaning the message of the Prophet ﷺ. And the second thing is that He wants qayyimah from you. He wants you qayyimah, qiyam, to stand. He wants you to be steadfast. And then when you link that to salah, what that tells you is that Allah does not want the prayer itself, it's the idea of being steadfast. But steadfast to what? Steadfast to God, your uprightness. Qiyam means standing upright. Qayyimah means uprightness. Istiqamah comes from it to be resilient. Okay? Istiqamah is to be resilient. So what Allah is asking for you is to say, show me how loyal you are to me. Qayyimah is loyalty. Yeah? So when you stand for prayer, be loyal to me. But your loyalty isn't the act of the prayer, because people stand lazily. وَإِذَا قَامُوا لِلصَّلَاةِ قَامُوا كُسَالَى. When they stand for prayer, they stand lazily. In the Surah Ma'un, same thing. Allah says when they stand sahun. Like they're not really interested, they're just doing it to impress other people. Allah said, I don't want that. That's not loyalty. That's just impressing people. What I want is you to sincerely connect yourself to me. Stand so that your heart is connected to me. There's khudu and there's khushu there. So there's a responsibility for each and every one of us to do that before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah uses that in the context of two things. In Surah Bayyinah, Allah says, I need two things from you that are indicated that you are amilus salihat, that you're people that do good deeds. They are what? Number one, stand for the prayer in the way that I described. And number two, interestingly, Allah doesn't mention Hajj, He doesn't mention fasting, He only mentions two things. The second thing is zakah. Zakat. He says, give your zakat. And what that means is, salah is your personal obligation to God. Zakat is your communal obligation to society. So Allah says, I want two things from you. One is, don't forget your responsibility to me. And the second thing I want from you is, I don't want you to forget your responsibility to mankind. So this call to creating responsibility within the community. He doesn't mention in Bayyinah, He talks about the mushrikeen, Allah talks about Ahlul Kitab. He doesn't mention any other thing, He just mentions those two things. And this is a Madani surah, by the way. It's not an early surah. Surah Bayyinah came in the Madani period. So people knew about these fasting, they knew about all of these things. Then obviously we come on to zakat. Allah emphasizes zakat. It's communal obligation. 10 minutes, okay. A communal obligation. Like, you need to make sure that when you're earning 2.5% of everything you have, doesn't belong to you. It belongs to society, and not just any society, the downtrodden in society. The people who are at the lowest, the people in the hierarchy that you create in life, they're the people you put at the bottom. And there's surely a message there from God. Because if zakah means tazkiyah means purification, all of the scholars agree that the purification isn't for them, and it's not even a purification of the world, it's a purification of you. Yeah? So when you're giving zakat, Allah says to you, not only are you helping them, you're doing something more important, you're helping yourself. So you need them as much as they need you. Right? So it's flattening that society, it's that hierarchy to say you at the top, you owe something to the people at the bottom. And you owe it to them in such a way that they find themselves moving up that hierarchy, and then they give back. So there's this cycle of giving back to society. So we have fasting. Right? So what's the obligation of fasting? I mentioned leadership. Right? So what does fasting do? Well, fasting gets you to appreciate what it's like to be the people at the bottom that don't get to eat. That's what leaders do. It's the undercover boss. Go and learn what it's like not to eat for a day. And you will change your mindset. I guarantee you'll be a lot more open to whether you do or not is down to you, but you'll be a lot more amenable to giving somebody some money that's homeless if you've been fasting for the day than if you haven't. Right? So it creates this affiliation with your fellow human beings at the level of being human beings, not just because you know them. Okay? But it also does create an affiliation in terms of knowing them, because Allah categorizes them as the fuqara, and by giving something a name, it creates identity, which means you can connect to it. So then they don't become just the homeless guy on the street, it becomes the person that you can benefit from. Right? So you can go and give them something, and you can benefit from it. Right? And another word for zakat is sadaqah. Sadaqah is another type. Sadaqah comes from the word sidq, which means truthfulness. So a test of how truthful you are to God is giving sadaqah. Like, you put your money where your mouth is, in other words. Yeah, it's the thing you love the most, but give it away. And then fasting, and then Hajj. What does Hajj do? Well, in the context of identity, it does the very thing that you're trying to. So you're trying to recognize how many identities that you have, and what happens is you're the middle. So if you had 3 layers, the beginning is where you are when you're born. Allah says you're all the same. Min dhakarin wa untha. And then Allah says what? He says He puts you into shu'ub wa qaba'il. He puts you into tribes, you split into groups. And then what's the final stage? لِيَتَعَارَفُوا, that you find one another and you find equality and equity in all of you. What do you do in Hajj? In Hajj, the first thing you do when you get onto the ihram is you basically strip away all your identity and you wear on something that makes you all equal, right? You literally become one again. So Hajj is an opportunity for you to look at the strength of your ummah and realize I'm not above anybody. And it's actually a reminder of what will happen on the Day of Judgment, because on the Day of Judgment, Allah tells us in the Quran that mountains will be flattened. Allah describes them as cotton wool. It'll become like cotton wool. And then He says everything will be flattened and everyone will gather in one place, and no one person will be better than the other. You'll be the same. So it's this idea that you eventually, the purpose of multitude of identities is recognizing that there is what I often say is there is there is a uniqueness that we all have, which is the difference, which is the identities. But there is also something we all share in common. Right? Something we all share in common. And both of these are equally important. The commonality and the uniqueness ensure that you don't ever fall into this trap of too much uniqueness and not enough recognition of commonality. It leads to ego. And dissolving yourself or diffusing yourself into the community with that identity creates not tribes. What it creates is sects. It creates sects. It creates a tribal group mentality, which is when you strip away your uniqueness and you become the identity of the group. Allah doesn't call to that. Right? And I'm very vocal about this. This idea that Islam is this one thing that all of us dress the same and look the same and be the same has no foundation in Islam whatsoever. Right? Nothing whatsoever. And actually, the definition of a cult, and remember this, the definition of a cult is that your personal identity is lost at the cost of the group identity. And the identity and the definition of a group, a qabila, a tribe, is that your group's identity grows with your identity. Yeah. So when your group becomes the amalgamation and the uniqueness of everybody, you have a rich group that innovates in a positive sense. Yeah? It grows because you learn from one another, you take from each other. When you say this is what the group is, and now you've got to adhere to the group's rules, how would the group ever change? How would it ever develop? How would it better itself? Does that make sense? It's a cult. So you then lose all your identity. People start dressing in like Arab clothing, and they think that that's Islam. I'm not saying do it. You want to do it, by all means do it. But remember, that's not what Islam is calling to. Or people start wearing the same item of clothes, and they think that's Islam. That's not Islam. Islam doesn't call to that. Islam says you have something that's unique about you. You've got to bring it to the table. But there's aspects to you that are destructive, and you've got to recognize those and learn from the group. Because what it does is that kind of group reinforcement is a positive thing if you bring people's experiences. If you shed all that and you have a manifesto, then you have communism, or you have cults. And marriage is quite strong. And I want to go to these two verses because I've got 4 minutes and I don't really get to develop my what I was trying to say. Hopefully it's been beneficial, inshallah, to some extent. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُم مَّوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. And I want to talk about this because everyone reads this verse when they get married. Like almost everyone loves this verse, Surah Rum. And it's a good verse to read. And amazing, but it's a good reminder. But if you got to read this in light of what I read earlier about qaba'il, because in the same way Allah tells you, look, if you read the Quran in a very scattered way, you're not going to appreciate the message. Read this again in light of what Allah tells you, that you came from one place, you became groups, and then your job is to find one another again. And then you read when Allah says, لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, to find peace amongst one another, is to say developing responsibilities between yourselves, growing and becoming the tribe, kind of forming back into that oneness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling to. It says, and it's from His signs that He created you from amongst yourselves, azwaj. He created you from that singularity. He created groups. لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, so that you may find one another, connect to one another. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ, and Allah created an affiliation with you. What does that tell you? That tells you that Allah has actually created an affiliation outside of your tribe, your immediate people that you connect to, your identity. Allah has made you such that you will fall in love with somebody that doesn't share your identity. Necessarily that will happen because your goal is to find people that don't share that identity and bring them to you and connect to them and realize that we're all one. And saying, yeah. And then Allah says, mawaddatan wa rahma, to find friendship and to find mercy. To find friendship and mercy, very powerful. Mawadda is if you're bringing somebody in that's not part of your tribe, your identity. The idea that if you live and if you've been brought up around Pakistanis, right, on a very superficial level, you're missing out. Because you have the opportunity to have mawadda, which is a strong, close friendship and affiliation with somebody who's not a Pakistani, right? And not only that, but it's a test of your rahmah too. Go and find that. And then Allah says, and the reason why it's very important to reflect on this in light of the other verse, is because Allah tells you to do that. He says, Inna fi dhalika, know that in this, in what I'm telling you, la ayat, there are many signs, not one sign, because you look at this and it tells you one thing. Allah says, Inna fi dhalika, in what I've just told you, there are many signs, but for who? لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, for people who will actually pay attention. When Allah tells you that, it's not just a superficial thing. He's telling you there are layers within layers of meaning that you can take for yourself. And then Allah says in another verse, الَّذِينَ يُنْفِقُونَ فِي السَّرَّاءِ وَالضَّرَّاءِ وَالْكَاظِمِينَ الْغَيْظَ وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And then in the context of your families, what does Allah say? This is related to the other verse too. It's a completely different surah, but I want to try and bring it all together in your minds. Is Allah says, but you know when you form those, thinking about rahmah and mawadda, what happens when you form bonds with people? They're the people who often see the worst side of you. Right? They're the people that see the best side of you, but they often see the worst side of you. And that's where Allah says, الَّذِينَ يُنْفِقُونَ فِي السَّرَّاءِ وَالضَّرَّاءِ. He goes, those who give secretly and in open. That means two things. One is physical, the act of giving money, charity, give it privately and give it openly. And the second is the sadaqah that you give in terms of your behavior with your family. Because sometimes it's really easy to put on that image of we're a great family. And at home, it's not great. You know that we all do that. Listen, we have a persona, the public persona and the private persona. Allah says the best of you are those whose persona, that you have that public persona, you have that private persona, but those who give, in other words, that are as generous in terms of your heart and your behavior privately and openly. Yeah? And then Allah says, وَالْكَاظِمِينَ الْغَيْظَ, and those people who suppress their anger. Kazimin al-ghayz is quite a strong word. Ghayz is anger that gets built up in time. Yeah? It's something that, what I described at the beginning, you know what happens? Someone does something small, and it basically irks you and it keeps eating away at you, and they keep doing little stuff, and then eventually the little stuff becomes the big thing. Yeah? That's the ghayz. That's when the little things keep adding up and eventually you explode. And it's not the thing at the end, that's just the straw that broke the camel's back. It's everything. And the thing is, often it's hard to articulate it, because when that happens and someone says, well, you exaggerate, you're overreacting, is a common thing that you might hear, right? You're overreacting, and the person thinking, I'm not. Because you do this all the time, and the person will say, well, what do you mean all the time? Give me 2 examples. And that's it. It's hard to give examples because you can't articulate things. That's very hard to. Some people can, right? Some will give it a good go, but generally it's really hard because it's a build-up of emotion, and men do that a lot too. Sometimes you just overreact. You say something, and it's a build-up of stuff going on in there, and you can't articulate it because you don't have the words for it, right? So Allah says those people who kazimin are those people who diffuse their anger. They diffuse it. That itself calls to, for me, I interpret this, and I've done this in a Burda commentary some years ago when I did it, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to Madinatul Munawwara, the Prophet ﷺ, as Al-Kazima. One of the names of it is Kazima, and the reason is because it was often people would go to the resting place of the Prophet and it completely diffused them. It was their way of going to visit him, and it just diffused them completely. People would go to the Prophet ﷺ, what would happen? They'd go angry with him, and they'd walk away in love with him. Right? So he's known as Kazimin al-Kazim, because when people saw him, they immediately fell in love with him. And there's many examples of the famous one is the man that ran towards him with a dagger, and he saw his face and he ran the other way, and he died. And another occasion when a man tried to kill him going around the Kaaba, and he kept trying, and the Prophet kept turning to him and said, what are you thinking? And he knew something was on his mind, and eventually he couldn't do it, and he said, this is not the face of a liar. So people, when they saw him, they immediately diffused their anger. So this is a word that means that built-up anger gets completely diffused. For me, what this calls to is finding a mechanism to diffuse your anger, which means you can't just relieve the air. You can't just press a button now, there you go, it's gone. Right? It's not like a tire. So how do you do kazimin al-ghayz? How do you become that? You've got to find an outlet. There's a responsibility to find an outlet to reduce, to get rid of it, and that's often talking, or it's doing something that will somehow do that. So in the context of being aware of yourself, in the context of having those conversations with your spouse or your parents even, or you being the parents doing that with your children, to be open about these are some of the things that I might do and I want you to tell me when it happens. In that sort of kind of you could say in that atmosphere, you will find that you naturally find you become, it becomes less, become more tolerant. I think if you create a household that's more tolerant, you will see that the reverberation of that affects society, because the people around you will be affected by it, and those around you. The people that honestly that I absolutely admire and hear, often some of the ones that I love are the ones that say very little. But when I see them, sometimes they just calm me down just by being around them. You know, my teacher is a great example of it for me. I can go in and he could have a lot of stress on his head and he'll just start laughing. And he will just sit there and he will talk about like some random thing that he's read. And you know, it diffuses me completely if there's anything on my mind, because what I see is somebody who, I just see a scholar, because his outlet was just that book. Like he can leave everything and he can just go to it and he can have a really interesting discussion. And he can laugh and joke with you, or he can be very serious with you. So you have people that will do that for you, you know. So trying to find some sort of outlet. So just finally, the things I want to touch on. I know I said I won't get into specifics because I know myself and I don't get a chance to go into specifics. And it was only 2 hours and it's quite a big topic. But if there's any message that we take away from this, is number one, it is recognizing there are these three elements to us. And the self is the primary element. And there is a separate seminar we're doing on the self. And I think Maulana Sajjad is going to be doing it. And he will be talking a lot about the physical stuff. I mentioned Islamic identity and, you know, thobes and hats and stuff. I'm sure he's going to go gung-ho on it when he gets a chance. So hopefully what you'll read between the lines is that Islam didn't come to give you a dress code. It really didn't. I'm telling you, it didn't give you a dress code. There was no script that we were given to say, you must wear this, you must wear that, you must wear this. Right? What it gave you was this a set of principles. And one of the key principles was that we can inherently be very, in preserving ourselves, other people can suffer. So what it did was it gave us responsibility. And now we're encouraged to live out that responsibility by getting married, by looking after our parents. I said, why did Allah to constantly talk about that? Is because that's where it started. Allah tells you because that's the way you remind yourself that you came from a commonality, because it connects you back to your parents. So your parents are the vehicle through which the separation happened, that you became a group. So Allah keeps calling you to, and He keeps saying ihsan. And on another occasion I will talk about that inshallah. But why does God keep associating ihsan with your parents constantly? And then in the case of multiplicity, this idea that you're one and then you split up, Allah also talks about shirk in the same context. Shirk means multiplicity, but in association with God. These are not accidents. There is a reason why God talks about it in that way, and it kind of ties in with this. So self and family, which is where I kind of hopefully touched on some of this, and that's this idea that your responsibility starts with yourself, and it starts through your family as a mechanism to ultimately affect the society, and recognizing that each and every one of us is a leader in some capacity, the shepherd of a flock, as the Prophet calls it, and then ultimately it's society. And I had that, which is the bit where I get onto the specifics, but inshallah on another occasion, perhaps if this has been beneficial, then we can maybe do something that's a bit more focused, because I need 2 hours often just to lay the groundwork, and then I have to build on it. So I hope it's been beneficial inshallah, and I apologize if I didn't get into specifics and you wanted those.